What happens when your best friend suddenly becomes your worst enemy? In the world of global trade, that's exactly what's happening between the US, Canada, and the EU. With Trump's escalating trade wars and protectionist policies, the US is pushing its closest allies away. But here's the real question. Could this force Canada and the European Union into the arms of their biggest rival, China? And what would that mean for your everyday life? In a rapidly changing world, alliances are shifting, and trade wars are escalating. Donald Trump's protectionist America First policies have sparked tensions between the US, Canada, and the EU historically, some of its closest economic partners. But now, these key players are beginning to look elsewhere towards China. In this video, we'll explore how Trump's tariffs are pushing Canada and the EU to rethink their trade strategies. Could these once steadfast allies abandon the US for China's massive market and economic power? And what does this mean for global trade and your pocketbook? Chapter 1. Trump's tariff and the Canada-EU response. It all started with Trump's America First approach, a protectionist policy that led to tariffs being slapped on goods from both Canada and the European Union. For the US, this was an effort to reduce the trade deficit with key allies. For Canada, this was especially harsh, as Trump initiated tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, claiming they posed a national security threat to the US. On January 20th, as one of my many first executive orders, I will sign all necessary documents to charge Mexico and Canada a 25% tariff on all products coming into the United States and its ridiculous open borders, Trump declared, threatening more tariffs in an effort to address trade imbalances. The European Union, for its part, responded swiftly. The EU stated it would respond robustly and collectively to any tariffs imposed. Macron and other European leaders indicated that Trump's actions might strengthen EU unity, particularly in the face of Russia's growing influence and China's expansion. Canada, which shares one of the closest economic relationships with the US, was also drawn into the fray. The imposition of tariffs on Canadian exports like steel and aluminum in 2018 led to retaliatory tariffs on US goods like bourbon, peanut butter, and ketchup, hitting several American industries. Even today, these tensions remain a point of friction between the two countries. If these tariff wars continue, Canadians and Europeans will likely see higher prices for everyday goods. For example, as steel and aluminum become more expensive, the cost of manufacturing items ranging from cars to appliances will increase, potentially raising the prices of these products in stores. In Canada, industries like automotive and construction will feel the strain, leading to higher costs for construction projects, home renovations, and even cars. In Europe, similar effects will be felt in the manufacturing sector. Chapter 2. The impact of protectionism on Canada and the EU. Trump's trade wars are not just about dollars and cents. They're about geopolitics. The effect of his tariffs on Canada and the EU isn't just economic, it's strategic. As Trump's tariffs rise, both Canada and the EU may start to see China as a viable economic partner. Let's break down the numbers. In 2020, the EU's trade with the US amounted to $555 billion in goods, with Europe enjoying a trade surplus of about $150 billion. However, Europe's trade relationship with China is no small matter. China overtook the US as Europe's largest goods trading partner in 2020, with total EU-China trade reaching 586 billion euros, surpassing US trade by about 30 billion euros. Meanwhile, Canada, whose economy is closely tied to the US, saw its exports to the US total around $384 billion in 2020. However, Canada's total trade with China has been growing rapidly. In 2020, Canada's trade with China was about $25 billion in goods alone, a figure that continues to rise as both countries seek to expand economic ties. These numbers show a shift. As trade tensions with the US increase, both Canada and the EU are likely to recalibrate their strategies. Could China, with its massive market and economic potential, become a more attractive partner? A shift towards China means cheaper goods and potentially lower production costs. For Canadians, this could result in more affordable electronics and consumer products as China's manufacturing sector grows and becomes an even larger part of global supply chains. Europeans could see similar benefits, particularly in industries reliant on Chinese imports, such as technology, electronics, and textiles. However, with geopolitical tensions rising, there might also be trade-offs in terms of product quality or potential supply chain vulnerabilities. Chapter 3. The risk of pivoting towards China. Could Canada and the EU really pivot towards China? Let's take a closer look. Over the past few years, the EU and China have engaged in more complex and nuanced trade relations. In fact, China became the EU's largest goods trading partner in 2020. The EU has long recognized China as a key player in global supply chains, particularly in electronics, technology, and rare earth minerals. For Europe, maintaining good relations with China isn't just about trade. China is Europe's largest export market for cars, machinery, and pharmaceuticals. In 2023, the EU exported 114 billion euros worth of machinery to China and 4.6 billion euros in cars. But there are risks. The EU has become increasingly wary of China's state-driven capitalism, its growing influence in global markets, and its human rights record. Still, Europe can't ignore the economic opportunities China presents. For Canada, the relationship with China is trickier. While Canada is heavily reliant on its economic relationship with the US, it's also seeking to strengthen ties with China in areas like natural resources, technology, and infrastructure. For example, in 2020, Canada exported about $2.3 billion worth of minerals and metals to China, including copper, gold, and uranium resources that China heavily imports. But here's the catch. China's growing role in global trade isn't without controversy. Beijing's increasingly assertive foreign policies, such as its stance on Taiwan and the South China Sea, make it a divisive partner on the global stage. Still, Canada and the EU have to weigh the economic benefits against the geopolitical risks. For ordinary people, a closer trade relationship with China might mean more affordable consumer products, including electronics, textiles, and even household goods. If these trade relationships expand, the cost of everyday items like smartphones, clothing, and even cars could drop due to lower manufacturing costs in China. However, a deeper dependence on China may also expose consumers to risks, such as supply chain disruptions or lower product quality due to less stringent regulations in some Chinese industries. Chapter 4. The US role in this equation. Trump's protectionist policies have certainly left their mark on North American and European politics. For both Canada and the EU, the US has long been the most important economic partner. But as Trump's tariffs rise, it seems the traditional understanding of the US as an unshakable ally is starting to fray. The US's trade deficit with the EU, in particular, has become a flashpoint. As of 2020, the US trade deficit with the EU stood at around $184 billion in goods alone. Trump has repeatedly pointed to this figure as evidence that Europe has unfair trade advantages. The protectionist approach is hurting relationships with key allies, and it's opening the door for China to swoop in and offer an alternative. This shift is dangerous for traditional industries that depend on US exports. For instance, the automotive sector in both Canada and the EU is highly vulnerable to tariffs as it relies heavily on US demand for vehicles. For consumers, a strained relationship with the US could result in higher prices for goods like cars, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, which are heavily traded across North American borders. But as trade with China increases, this could lead to lower prices for many imported goods. However, there's also the risk of market instability as countries rely more on China, especially given the geopolitical tensions surrounding Chinese policy. As the trade war between the US and its closest allies Canada and the EU escalates, the question remains, is Trump's protectionist stance pushing these key global players closer to China? The numbers show a potential pivot, as both Canada and the EU look to mitigate the risks of a strained relationship with the US by strengthening ties with China. For ordinary citizens, these shifts could mean cheaper products, new job opportunities, but also new challenges, higher costs in some sectors, disruptions in others, and a changing global landscape that will require careful navigation. Stay tuned as we continue to monitor how these shifting alliances will reshape the world economy in the coming years.
Hold on to your seats. A global trade shockwave is happening as Italy steps in to fill the void left by US tariffs on Canada, a twist so unexpected, even the EU is in disbelief. In 2020, Italian exports stormed into Canada with a staggering $1.5 billion, and their wines alone smashed US numbers with $409 million in sales. Welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most jaw-dropping shifts in international trade. Italy, long renowned for its culinary excellence, is now rewriting the rules in Canada's agri-food market. Thanks to slashing customs barriers, Italian wines and cheeses are flying off the shelves, leaving traditional powerhouses like the US trailing behind. Stay tuned as we explore how Italy's explosive market entry is shaking up global trade and what this means for consumers and producers alike. Chapter 1. Background on Trump's tariffs. Let's start by setting the stage. Back in 2018, President Donald Trump imposed a series of tariffs on several nations, citing unfair trade practices. Among the hardest hit countries were Canada and Mexico, as well as China. For Canada, the US tariffs were particularly damaging because the two countries share one of the largest trading relationships in the world. In fact, the US is Canada's largest trading partner, accounting for approximately 70% of Canada's total exports. Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were imposed at rates of 25% and 10% respectively, were seen as a protectionist measure to bolster American industries. But Canada, a major exporter of both commodities to the US, quickly felt the sting of these trade restrictions. Canada's steel exports to the US were valued at $6.4 billion in 2018, and with tariffs in place, that figure dropped by over 38% in subsequent years. The threat of further tariffs loomed large, adding pressure on Canada to explore other trade avenues. How does this play out in the daily lives of Canadians? For consumers, the imposition of tariffs by the US can lead to higher prices on goods, especially in industries like automotive manufacturing and construction. With steel and aluminum becoming more expensive, everyday products such as cars, appliances, and even homes could see price hikes. On the flip side, this has pushed Canada to seek alternative markets, which, in the long run, could help stabilize prices as the country diversifies its trade relationships. Chapter 2: Canada's Strategy to Diversify Trade. By mid-2019, Canada's government began to recognize that relying heavily on the US market was no longer a viable long-term strategy. The possibility of further trade restrictions loomed large, especially with the looming implementation of US tariffs on Canadian goods. To counter this, Canadian officials turned to Europe and China as potential partners to bolster their trade portfolio. In 2020, Canada's total trade with the European Union amounted to $115.9 billion, with Italy contributing a significant share to this total. What's particularly interesting is how Canada has increasingly engaged with Italy, a country with a strong and growing presence in the Canadian market. Italy has historically been known for its high-quality food products, such as wine, cheese, olive oil, and pasta. These industries have been key drivers of Italian exports to Canada, and the relationship between these two countries has been steadily strengthening, particularly since the ratification of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the European Union in 2017. For everyday Canadians, a shift toward European markets, especially Italy, could have positive effects on the availability and quality of products. Expect to see more variety in high-quality Italian food products, such as wines, cheeses, and olive oils, becoming more readily available and affordable. The tariff reductions under CETA could also mean better pricing on many Italian imports, allowing Canadians to enjoy luxury items like artisanal foods, without the steep markup typically associated with imported goods. Chapter 3: Italy's Role in Canada's Trade Landscape. Italy's presence in the Canadian market is particularly notable in the agri-food sector. According to the most recent data, Italy is Canada's third largest supplier of agri-food products, trailing only the United States and Mexico. In 2020 alone, Italian agri-food exports to Canada were valued at approximately $1.5 billion. This increase in trade is largely driven by CETA, which has reduced customs barriers and improved market access for Italian goods. The deal has been particularly beneficial for Italian food products, especially those in high demand among Canadian consumers, such as wines and cheeses. In fact, Italy has surpassed the US as Canada's second-largest supplier of wine, with Italian wine exports to Canada reaching approximately $409 million in 2020. With the looming threat of US tariffs, Canada saw an opportunity to further strengthen its relationship with Italy, positioning Italian products as a viable alternative to American imports in several key sectors. For Canadian consumers, this shift could mean an expansion of choices, particularly when it comes to high-quality foods. Think more variety in Italian wines, cheeses, olive oils, and pasta available on supermarket shelves, often at lower prices due to the elimination of tariffs. Many Canadians who already enjoy Italian cuisine will benefit from enhanced availability and more competitive pricing. Chapter 4. CETA and its impact on trade relations. The impact of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement CETA cannot be understated. This landmark agreement has reduced tariffs, eliminated quotas, and opened up new sectors for trade between Canada and the EU. CETA has been instrumental in growing Italy's exports to Canada, especially in agri-foods, pharmaceuticals, and luxury goods. For example, the agreement has allowed Italian producers of wine and olive oil to access Canadian markets with lower tariffs, which has fueled an increase in exports. As a result, Italian agri-foods now